We'll go ahead and get started. As always, thank you everybody for making the drive into Columbus today. We appreciate it. Your hard work on Ohio's Recovery Foundation. I'd like to welcome a couple new members. Rob Radcliffe, if you could raise your hand and tell us maybe 30 seconds about yourself.
I'm a 40-year veteran of the Pickaway County Sheriff's Office. I served 8 years as sheriff, and I'm currently employed by the Pickaway County Common Police Force. I'm the governor's appointee.
Thanks for serving. And Scott Skylock, is that how you say it?
Skylock.
I'm sorry. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Lucas County, Region 4, 35 years in the behavioral health field, used to run a treatment agency, now run the mental health recovery services board for the last 12 years, and incoming president of our state association.
Excellent. Thank you. And Mike, if you want to take a roll call.
Sure. Director Bond.
Here.
Director Amen.
Here.
Director Fix.
Here.
Director Hondrew.
Here.
Director Old. Here. Director Miller.
Here.
Director Simmons.
Here.
Director Kozlowski.
Here.
Director Worsbicky.
Here.
Director Silac.
Here.
Director Cox.
Here.
Director Dodge.
Here.
Director Dreehouse.
Here.
Director Hohaddle.
Here.
Director Mattia.
Here.
Director Picciarelli.
Here.
Director Grigori. Here. Director Kidd.
Here.
Director Portman.
Here.
Director Roizen. Here. Director Smitherman.
Present.
Director Radcliffe.
Here.
Director Claymire.
Here.
Director McCully.
Here.
Miss anybody? Director Myers. All right, we have a quorum.
Excellent. So we have a quorum. We are going to need to go to executive session. If somebody would like to.
Make a motion to go into executive session for pending litigation, citing RC 121.22.
Right. And for a second, roll call.
Second.
Second. Okay. You can roll call.
Director Bond. Director Amen.
Yes.
Director Fix.
Yes.
Director Hondrew.
Yes.
Director Old.
Yes.
Director Meyer.
Mayor. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Director Miller.
Yes.
Director Simmons.
Here.
Director Kozlowski.
Yes.
Director Worsbicky.
Yes.
Director Silac.
Yes.
Director Cox.
Yes.
Director Dodge.
Yes.
Director Dreehouse.
Yes.
Director Hohaddle.
Yes.
Director Mattia.
Yes.
Director Picciarelli.
Yes.
Director Grigori.
Yes.
Director Kidd.
Here.
Director Portman.
Yes.
Director Roizen.
Yes.
Director Smitherman.
Yes.
Director Radcliffe.
Yes.
Director Claymire.
Yes.
Director McCully.
Yes.
So we're officially. So we're back at it. In advance of the meeting, everybody received the meeting minutes. If we could get a motion to approve the meeting.
To adopt Fix.
Second. Alright. Any questions or discussions? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. Right. The next item is talking about the settlement allocation. We talked about this for the last 2 months, and hopefully today we can make some decisions on how we allocate years 1 and 2. I don't know the exact numbers, Catherine, you can help me with that, but we did receive the lump sum of 54 million plus some. We'll talk about that in a second. How do we break out years 1 and 2, Jim?
If you go to in the packet, there's a financial, it shows them that the actual is in the cash balance. So it's like 34 million from distributors, 16 million from.
So with that, we'd like to open up the floor for further discussion on how we distribute year 1 and year 2. Anybody like to take a stab at it?
Anyone?
I can make a suggestion.
I'll take a stab.
Okay, go,
I
please.
think year one and year two should be distributed 100% to the regions, minus the operational cost of the foundation.
Anything else?
So, you and I had a conversation, you mentioned that there's, either the settlement that was unanticipated, which I think is the $6 million.
That's correct.
Hey, Jeff, you can just speak up a little.
Yeah, sorry. So Larry and I had a conversation last week. There was an unexpected chunk of money that came our way, the $3.6 million from NOAT. We discussed the idea that, you know, the concept of putting that first chunk of money for the first 2 years, 100% to the regions. One, sends the right message to the regions, and number two, allows us time to see if there are statewide programs that could benefit the entire state over time. But that those programs aren't jumping off the page to us today. At least I've not heard of anybody that's got that really great idea that we can implement statewide tomorrow, spend a bunch of money on and get great results. I've not heard of that. If somebody has, then they can correct me, but so the idea would be to put that 54 million, the 36 million from MLU distributor year 1 and 2, the 20 million from MLU Janssen year 1 and 2, put that 54 million 100% out to the regions, and allow that 3.6 million in bound money, if you will, unexpected revenue. Put that into the investment fund that we had talked about in our last meeting that Senator McCauley was interested in advocating for. It allows us to accomplish both, right? We can say we've got 100% of the money that we expected going to the regions, and it's a good chunk of money. And we have $3 2/3 million that we can invest in as those state projects become available in a couple of years. We'll have money there to at least get things started. So that proposal made sense to me. And I'm advocating for that today.
And to further explain what Jeff's talking about, the 3.6 was not on our radar. The litigation was in bankruptcy court, so we didn't think we were going to get anything. And then lo and behold, when we got 54 million, we also got the 3.6. So it was something that was unexpected and surprise. Again, as some of the folks that and just a little clarification, Jeff, we would need to take some money out for operations and
Right.
but that way the regions are getting 100% of what was originally going to be allocated, less operations for year 1 and 2. Year 3, which will come sometime later in the year, we can discuss that at a further time, because we can't, not only can we not make the decision, we have to make it once we receive the monies. And then we have to give a 90-day notice of how we're going to distribute it. So it seemed appropriate just to talk about the first 2 years.
It was my understanding when I read the NOAT, the 3.6 million. I believe the last page, they already kind of divided those by the 19 regions. So I wasn't sure if we had to follow the breakdown they already provided or not.
We did. Go ahead.
That PDF was provided for help. It was an informational sheet that if we wanted to break everything down, they went ahead and did the work. So it's not part of the actual settlement requirements. It's not part of that judge's order. It was an informational sheet put out by the pharmaceutical company to assist regions.
Dr. Rosen had something. Dr. Rosen.
Muted.
I still feel that there is an important point in building an endowment, because I think that this problem, if all we're doing is treating it and not learning how to prevent it, that we won't ever have enough money, even with whatever it is, 500 million over the 18 years. So I believe we should set aside more than 3% or more than 4% in the first 2 years. Meaning I think we should say, let's set aside 10% for statewide programs, including all the money, so that we can then build the endowment so that when, whether it's in this state or another state, a project that says, look, this is a likely way of preventing this problem, and whether that's using Mongerno or other things, that we as a state and that many counties in the state will be able to fund that from the state funds so that we can participate and be a major force in prevention, not just treatment. I think that requires us doing something like preventing obesity in each of you, that is delaying gratification so that you have less disability and less problems later on. I think the whole setup of the foundation was made and the statewide concept was there so that we could use this when a great idea is developed, for instance, in county or in region 19, that then we can try it the next year and we'll have enough funding to try it as a statewide program. And I think if we said all of a sudden in year 3, let's take 30 million and do this as a statewide program, that would hurt each of the individual regions by knocking down their funding tremendously. So that I think if we're going to do something prevention, we need to build up this fund from the start. And while I thank for 3.6 million, I think that's only 3 or 4% of what we'll be getting in the first 2 years. And I think we need 10% or more to be able to do what is right for the citizens of the state.
Thank you, Dr. Rosen. We have 4 questions in.
Just as a point of information, that 3.6 million represents 6.3% of the total. Rough math.
So we have
Not of the first 2 years.
Yes, sir.
It's 3.6 of, as I calculated, 87 million. 3.6 of 87 is not 6.3%.
Well, we're not making a decision on year 3 today.
Oh, year 2, first 2 years.
Year
I thought.
1, just year 1 and 2, because we can't make a decision on year 3. We could talk about it, but the decision has to be made once we receive the funds, which we have not yet done. So with that, we have several questions along here, so we'll just go down the road. Denise, were you the first one there? Yes.
I don't think I was, but anyway, I'm happy to speak.
We'll just go down.
Thank you. So I too am a regional representative and feel very protective of the regions. We, by the way, are using some of our regional allocation for prevention work. So I don't think we should assume that regional money is not being spent for prevention and treatment and law enforcement and public health and all the things that we've been dealing with over the last 7 years from where I sit. So I agree with the proposal that 100% should go to the regions with the overhead. And I think we always assume overhead comes off of this. So let's talk about it in those terms. This additional money, you know, there was a proposal about investment in using some of the regional allocation for investment. So this money, if we were to not dump it into the bucket, right, and then to be dispersed down, and it sits alone, if that is to be expected to be that strategy is for years 1, 2, and I appreciate you don't want to talk about year 3, but it's $3.6 million. So from my vantage point, if we say that 3.6, let's say over the 3 years is used for the investment piece, and then the allocation that we have is 100% to the regions for those 3 years, that 3.6 is carved off. I can get my arms around that. I can support that. My question is, what happens when we get more money? Because this isn't the last time we're going to get more money. We've got all kinds of suits out there. And so I really feel strongly that at some point we need to have a formula that we all agree to that says if we get another 3.6 in 2 weeks, I don't want to have a conversation about, well, we're just going to put that into investment and not have that go down to the regions. Because ultimately, the formula should dictate what the regions get and what we're setting aside for investment. So that's my only kind of caveat with this. I think because the numbers kind of match up for me in my simple mind, that 3 years, 3.6, I'm like, oh, all right. But I do not think that we should take this approach every time we have new money come in, that it's just, you know, set aside for investment and the regions don't see any of that money, because ultimately it should run through a formula that the regions participate in.
I would agree with Denise. She and I had a conversation about this earlier, and her concern was that we would set precedent. We, by doing what we're doing, it's not setting precedent, because every single time we receive money, we have to discuss it and debate it. And in year 10, we're gonna look a lot different than we are in year 1, right? So there could be multi-region projects that are just phenomenal that we wanna, you know, discuss and debate, and maybe we put the lion's share to that. I don't know. Nobody knows what 10 years looks like. But every time we receive money, we need to talk about how, especially the monies that are additional monies, talk about how we're going to allocate it. So we need to have the debate, we need to discuss it, we need to do what we're doing now. We don't have to take 3 months to do it, but we certainly should vet it and look at it, and we're not setting precedent by doing what we're doing, in my opinion. So thank you for your thoughts. And we can talk about year 3. We'll still have to ratify it later on by our bylaws. So we could discuss it. It just, we can't take action.
And I respect that, but we can have a conversation and a common understanding
Certainly.
about, you know, if the regions are gonna say, all right, we're willing to not have that 3.6 go into the overall pot, which would be the expectation from where I sit. Then I think we need to talk about, we have a common understanding about years 1, 2, and 3 going 100% to the regions otherwise. And then we, you know, it would be so much simpler if we had a formula for any new money that we just run it through a formula. We don't have to have these kinds of debates every time we receive an additional payment.
But I also think it's important to note that because we're going to put it in an endowment, doesn't mean it's going to go to the state. It could still go to the regions. Oh.
Just not going to the regions.
I just had a quick question related to the windfall that we received. I know that the state has their portion, what, they get 15% of this. Did they get a similar windfall?
No, I don't know.
Yes, so they received 15% of this. 30% went to the counties and 55% came to.
So obviously they didn't get 3.6, but they got some money that they were unexpected to get. So in essence, they've been compensated.
Well, just so we're clear, we're talking about statewide programs that this board would fund, not money going to the state of Ohio.
Two different entities, State of Ohio, One Ohio Foundation, statewide initiatives.
Thank you.
I think Jeff's proposal is very fair. I mean, if we just came to a simple vote, the regions would get all the money, but the MOU doesn't allow that. We have to get all 4 classes to agree. And in listening to the conversations over the last several meetings, what I've heard is this, some people want some investment. This is a beautiful way to meet that expectation. The regions are getting the 54 million distributed amongst them. It's a way to move the ball forward without having yet another meeting where we talk about the interest that we want. I mean, I think this is a really nice compromise. And if everybody's amenable, I don't know that we're gonna walk out with everybody finding a proposal that everyone's more happy about.
I just wanted to point out that when we're talking about having statewide programs for prevention, I really think a lot of our regions are focused on prevention. So when we're talking about great ideas, I expect them to come up from the regions, and then the state can emulate what a region may have come up with. So just to say, well, we have to put it away and it's going to be for prevention when the state has a great idea. I think those are going to come from the regions. And so let's give the regions a chance to do it.
Thank you.
Clearly in the minority here, I do think the regions have borne the brunt and we need to be really give a lot of attention there. At the same time, there are a lot of statewide initiatives that are important and that can impact us very broadly. And I hope that we can think about that. If it's not now, soon. There's massive workforce shortages in substance use disorder treatment that can probably only be addressed on a statewide issue. We've been talking about treatment and prevention, but we haven't been talking about recovery. And we need to talk about that long term too. I don't know what the current data says, but for quite a while, the people that were most vulnerable to dying by overdose were people who relapsed. So we need to be able to support those folks and create recovering communities and recovering support that work that way. And there are a number of statewide possibilities. I think we've had a good forum to discuss the regional issues at length and not the state issues. So maybe that's why we're less aware of them, but I would advocate that we invest heavily in the regions, but also don't forget what's possible statewide.
So to speak to the workforce, the governor and Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services has about $87 million going out to help workforce, along with a potential increase in Medicaid rates that I think that they're thinking that's where the benefit's going to go. I also believe that in some discussions that we look at how this gets distributed to the regions, this gives some regions some opportunities to build some capacity in their areas to work together. So most of the good kind of work, my guess would be within those different regions as opposed to spreading out across the state right this second. Because again, to me, anything that comes forward from the state, a statewide thing, probably hasn't been fully vetted yet. And regions have been waiting and waiting and waiting patiently, some of them multiple county areas. This will make a significant difference to them. But again, with respect to what you said, yes, there are going to be some statewide things. I think it's important statewide. Yep.
Senator McCauley, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I would say, while I would agree with Dr. Rosen much more that we need to have an idea as to what this looks like in the future, and I'm a little more concerned with the precedent that we would set if we give 100% of the funding to the regions, and that's going to create an expectation going forward by each of these regions that they would receive 100% of the money going forward. I also would not be against striking a middle ground on all of this. And I think the proposal that that 3.6 million that was unexpected would go into an endowment of sorts that really has kind of an unspecified purpose at this point. We're just going to put it there and let the money grow. If we use it for statewide projects going forward, great. If we decide to fund statewide projects out of the planned settlement money going forward and we let that money grow into the future, great. But I would also say that as it pertains to this conversation, we don't know what those statewide projects may be going forward. And as far as the concept of a formula or anything like that, I think that's getting a little bit out over our skis. And so I think we should deal with what's in the silo right now, that being year 1 and 2, and then the 3.6 million. I would be amenable to that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, discussions?
Just one more thing that was raised related to the state allocation. We've talked before about a match from this group and from the other folks that are getting the allocation, i.e. the state. And so I think we should send a message, if people would be amenable to it, just to suggest that this newfound money maybe on our end gets invested, also on their end gets invested. And we have a common investment then, and a bit of a match. Ours is greater, but still they would be, the concept would be floated to them that we are looking for them to help out with this endowment fund.
I'm glad you brought that up. I had a meeting with the state treasurer earlier this week, and he has some programs and he's very passionate about the opiate addiction issue. And there could be some opportunities with his funds. And we've also met with some private entities that may have possibilities for matching funds as well. So certainly, and that takes the money a lot further, obviously, if we could leverage it.
One of the ways to learn more about what's available in the state and what people are thinking about in the state is to invest perhaps in some planning grants or some seed grants that could bring forward proposals that we could entertain. We don't know what we can do at the regional level. I don't think what we can know about the state level. I'm not sure a statewide investment, investing in recovery is prevention. So I'm not sure a statewide investment.
Jane, I see you have a question.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to weigh in. to say that I agree with this proposal, that we move ahead expeditiously, go ahead and get the 54 million out to the regions ASAP. I like the idea of putting the 3.6 into an endowment. And I also like Denise's idea of developing a formula going forward. But I think for today, our business is to get this money moving, to get it out. This is a one-time, first step in the right direction. And so I would just like to embrace this proposal and support it going forward.
If there's no other.
Smitherman's hands up.
Christopher, you have a comment or question?
Well, the comment is I actually agree with moving forward today with the compromise in years 1, 2, and the 3.6 million. The only thing I want to weigh in on is to say I think we're going to have to come back with the elephant in the room and have a discussion about statewide initiatives and funding and also the investment piece. I don't think that this conversation is going to put that to rest. But I think we've come to a good resting place where I think we can move forward with a vote and with the compromise that's in front of us. But I'm just in the camp that I think long-term investing is important. And I think making sure that the statewide initiatives are also invested in. And I think we're gonna need that over the 18 years. So anyway, I think we're at a good resting place and I'm ready to move forward.
Thank you. Senator McCauley, and then you too. Senator McCauley, go ahead.
Thanks, Larry. I would agree with Director Smitherman on this. I think I agree that there very well could be some pretty robust statewide projects that we want to invest in that this endowment simply is not capable of doing in the near term. And so if I could ask that the minutes reflect that and that the motion as well be read as it will be worded in the minutes before we vote on it, to reflect very clearly that this only deals with funding in years 1 and 2 and the 3.6 million of unexpected money that we received. And then that be the motion. I'm not making the motion right now, but I just would request that it be clearly read so everybody's on the same page with that. But I would also ask that the minutes reflect as well that while there were thoughts brought up about coming up with a formula or year 3 or whatever the case may be, that that there was no decision made and that there were varying thoughts on the issue.
Thank you. And Greta, did you have something?
I did, and just to follow up on what the senator said, I appreciate putting that out of the minutes and the recommendation language of the motion itself before we vote. But I wonder if it would be prudent, again, to point out in both places, just that the future, this does not, something around this not setting a precedence, but that this is for this time period only, and that the board will deliberate again on future funding decisions, some kind of statement like that. So it's very clear that we're not saying what we're doing now will be done exactly the same way in the future.
Yeah.
So 2 things. First is, would it make sense for us to put together some type of work session, July, August, September, around statewide projects? Because I know there are folks in the room who have some ideas. As I mentioned earlier, I've not heard those, but I would love to. So perhaps we could carve out an hour in one of our meetings to have folks who have statewide ideas that they could present to all of us. So we're all a little bit more educated on that. Chair would.
I like that idea. I think that's.
Second question is, do we have a number on what our operating expenses are going to be as we look to deduct that from these dollars for year 1 and 2?
We do. Jim, do you want to just quickly address that?
Sure. And so back in December, you passed a interim budget for operating. That was 1.2 million. It doesn't have any staffing, right? Any real full-time staffing. And so there will be an additional cost with that. We'll talk about the grant software today. But it should be in the 1.8 million range, I would think, 2 million.
So if we did a not to exceed 1.2 million in year 1 and 2 million in year 2, does that get the number where it needs to be, or does it need to be?
It could be close. We do have the litigation costs that we don't know where that's gonna end up falling, because obviously we still have a lot ahead of us.
Yeah, so if we did a not to exceed $3.5 million total,
I would assume that would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point there, the litigation costs.
Yeah.
It really isn't that's not factored really in the budget.
But I think that would be safe, and if we needed more, we could come back to the board if costs end up being out of whack. Frankly, I think we could be under that.
so I'd like to make a motion if it's appropriate to do so.
There's one more question, Senator McCauley.
I think I accidentally had my hand up.
All right, Jeff, I think you were making a motion.
So my motion is that we take the funding from year 1 and year 2, $34,648,406, the $20,045,815, and subtract $3.5 million for operating expenses. The remainder of that goes 100% split up to the regions according to the formula. And at the $3,667,677 goes into an investment fund. And that these are for, these allocations are for year 1 and 2 only, and that the board will reconvene to decide how to allocate year 3 going forward.
Second, any questions?
I actually will second that.
I have a question. So if the operations aren't 3.5 million, what happened?
The remainder would go back into the regions and any overage would come out of the regions.
Okay, are you amending your,
Yes, amended to that effect.
and would you second again? Any other questions?
I get some clarity on the dollar amount is your 3.5 just
Years 1 and 2.
1 and 2 years, so you're just multiplying.
Operating expenses. Well, year 1's gonna be less, year 2's gonna be more. It's just adding them together.
So, suggestion on that, when we put the 3.5 million into the operating fund, like all the regional funds, they will run a cash balance. You'll come and budget against the operating, you'll say, it's how much operating we want to spend this year. We'll spend it from the fund. If we have money left over in the fund, there'll be less funding the theater from future, future receipts. Does that make sense?
So you're saying there would be a carryover
Yeah,
for the
there's-
budget?
Like every region will have a carryover amount. They'll get an
I'll
amount.
rescind my amendment then. You're good with that?
I'm fine with
All
that.
right.
Okay, hold on, they're rescinding.
Sending the amendment about how the carryover money from the budget is dispersed. It's actually, we're saying it would be kept as a carryover for the budget.
Not to exceed 3.5.
Not to exceed 3.5 million.
If we do need to exceed it, we'll come back to the board, but I don't know why we would. I'm sorry. Jeff, would you mind restating the motion one more time?
The motion is, yes, that the money, the $34,648,406 from your MOU distributor year 1 and 2, and the $20,045,850 from Janssen year 1 and 2, less not to exceed $3.5 million for operating expenses. 100% of that total be distributed to the regions, and that the $3,667,677 from MOU NOAT 2 be put into an investment fund for future use, and that these allocations for year 1 and 2 are for year 1 and 2 only, and future years will be determined at future board meetings.
And then we have a second.
We had talked at the last meeting about the first distribution being the roughly 54 million. And then a second distribution by the end of the year, possibly coming up 34 million.
That's year 3.
At year 3. Year 1 and 2, Judge.
Got it.
Makes up.
Okay, if there's no other question discussions, we'll put this to roll call vote.
So I have restated motion by Director Fix.
Yeah, in a second.
Okay, sorry.
And I'll give it up.
Director Bond,
Yes.
Director Amen,
Yes.
Director Fix,
Yes.
Director Handrew,
Yes.
Director Old. Yes. Director Meyer,
Yes.
Director Miller,
Yes.
Director Simmons,
Yes.
Director Kozlowski,
Yes.
Director Worsbicky,
Yes.
Director Silat,
Yes.
Director Cox,
Yes.
Director Dodge,
Yes.
Director Dreehouse,
Yes.
Director Hohottle,
Yes.
Director Mattia,
Aye.
Director Picciarelli,
Yes.
Director Gregoire,
No.
Director Kidd,
Yes.
Director Portman,
Yes.
Director Roizen. Director Roizen.
Seems to be frozen.
Okay, we'll come back. Director Smitherman,
Yes.
Director Radcliffe,
Like them staying in the. Because I'm new and just.
Director Claymire.
Aye.
Director McCully,
Yes.
Director Roizen, are you with us? Director Dodge, did I call you?
You did.
Yeah, okay, all right. So then the motion passes with one abstention and one negative vote.
And the agreement passes as well.
Yes.
Mine may not have been recorded, but I'd be a positive as well.
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody. This was a difficult and challenging and somewhat painful process, but I think we've come up with a good decision. We had good debate, and I appreciate all the work that everybody put into it and the thought.
And I'd like to thank Chairman Kidd for all the effort that he's put into this. I know that he and I have had several conversations, and I know that he's had numerous conversations around the state. And this is a volunteer position that he's filling. So great work, Chairman Kidd. Thank you.
Good job. Great. So now we can move on to the investment policy. Don Mason, who is our chair, is not here, but I believe in the board packets, they are in there for review.
They are in the iPads. The online does not have them.
Fiscal policy that we're looking at.
Yeah, they were added late during the meeting, so if you just simply scroll up on your iPad screen, it should populate. There should be two added documents, Word documents.
So I would ask, given that this was just put in front of us within the past few minutes, is there an urgency to having this voted upon today? If there is, that's fine. Just tell us. If there's not.
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Is there, because we just got this within the past few minutes, is there an urgency to having this done today? If there is.
And I was going to mention that we typically like to give board members at least a week or up to. This one we did not, just because we were trying to get it out. Right now, we're able to make 4% with Key Bank and probably Fifth Third too, with just putting it into an account that we don't need approval for the investment. We can make an extra percentage if and we're talking about $54 million, if we pass the investment policy. We could do it next month, but we could lose potentially $60,000 or $70,000 in income. We could pass it this month and revise it next month if we choose to. There's a lot of options. We don't have to pass it today because again, you didn't get a chance to review it. But anyway, that's where we are.
Is there someone from the committee that could speak on behalf of Mr. Mason?
Do you want to talk?
Sure, I can speak to it. So we have two investment advisors, Fifth Third and Key Bank, which were approved by the board. Both of them submitted a draft policy. We then combined the policies together into one policy, sent it back to the advisors to review and comment. And so they both have done that a few times. We've been back and forth, and that is the policy you have in front of you right now. I would say there are essentially, in my opinion, two different types of investments here. The endowment investment would be invested differently than the regional portion. So we have money today, and between today and when it gets distributed, we like to maximize the earnings on that. Protecting 100% of the principal. Well, that's what we told the banks, protecting 100% of the principal. Who said any of that, right? For the next 3 months or whatever it takes to distribute the funds. So that's one form of investment. The other is an endowment, which may invest a little more aggressively than the cash balance.
But in both cases, the principal is protected, right?
Yeah.
Can I make a motion that we invest the money at the highest safe return? If that's 5%, let's do 5%. And then we can review this and vote on this policy next month.
Well, we would almost have to approve the policy and then we could revise it next month. Because the banks need the investment policy approved before they do it.
The motion that we approve this policy with the understanding that we'll have it on the agenda to review again next month.
Second.
Any questions, discussions?
We've lost the policy, but you talked about the duration. Shall be.
It's all short term, so we can pull the monies out when we distribute the funds.
I know, but if we're talking about an endowment, maybe I misunderstood the conversation. Duration restrictions, the maximum maturity for any individual security is 2 years. The maximum average portfolio duration is 1 year.
Maximum. We could pull it out before then.
Right, but I don't know what that means. Does it mean so we have an endowment in certain stocks, they're gonna churn it every year?
Well, we would never, I don't say never, because we have the 3.6 million, but everything that we do will be short-term anyway, with the exception perhaps of 3.6. So under a year, which they would consider short-term.
So the investment advisors, this is right from them. This would not be something that you would stick into account and let it ride. I mean, you would have reevaluated. It would reevaluate on a periodic basis, and so this requires them to reevaluate at least once a month.
I mean, should we be trusting the investment advisors to draft the policy? That's really a bigger issue here, right? Should we maybe look to other foundations to see what their investment policies are? Before we trust a bank who's going to be.
I may address that. So Don's not here today, but Don is the chairman of the Investment Advisory Board at Kent State University, if I understand that title correctly, something like that. And has been involved with programs like this for a long time. And I have to imagine, I didn't sit on that committee, but I have to imagine that he had a very heavy hand in drafting this policy. And again,
with that said, I met with
1 month policy.
Key Bank, and they invest all the state of Ohio money that with the treasurer's office. So the treasurer told me that they're moving 550 billion a day back and forth among what they're doing and what Key does. The Key is the state's bank. So that if the investment's safe, they, in conjunction with the third, help write the policy. We can't review it. We can pull this off the table until next month and debate it. You could lose an extra couple percentage points on a significant amount of money, but if it's such a pleasure of the board, we could pull it.
Just for the record, I'm not comfortable with this, but 60,000 is 60,000. As long as we have it on the agenda to review next month, I don't know how much harm we can put ourselves into in 30 days.
We do have a motion and a second, so any further debate, we can vote on it. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion carried. And we'll make sure it's on the agenda next month as well. All right. Jim and Jeanette, you guys want to talk about the fiscal policy?
Sure. So our committee met on Monday to go over the draft fiscal policy. Essentially, this policy establishes the guidelines, our roles and responsibility in overseeing fiscal activity for the foundation, And it kind of puts in place some controls for operations of the fiscal activities, budgeting, accounting, procurement, asset management. I think some of the key things to point out, we do have in the policy that the foundation will have an annual independent audit done. With respect to the operating budget, we will have, staff will have some flexibility, but any budget item exceeding 10% of the budget would require approval of the finance committee or the executive committee. We'll use standard accounting procedures, incorporate a chart of accounts. We will follow the fiscal, or our fiscal year will follow the calendar year. We'll use appropriate accounting software to track. Have some guidelines for purchasing so that anything greater than $5,000 will require written proposals or quotes. Requests for proposals should be used when cost is not the most important factor in the procurement decision, and procurement exceeding $25,000 will require board approval. In the policy, we have added that grantees will have to submit budgets with their applications. We're going to have some flexibility so that the amount that the grantees receive, it'll balance their operational flexibility as well as mitigating the foundation's financial risk. We were a little bit concerned about, as soon as the grant is issued, giving a lump sum payment to the grantee. And then we would require that any grantee receiving more than $750,000 in a single year be subject to a single audit. And I think that's consistent with a lot of federal funding programs. So a lot of our organizations in the region may already be familiar with that process. And then we have, we'll maintain a list of fixed assets and physically tag anything that has a value of over $500. And anything cost exceeding 25, any asset with a cost exceeding $2,500 will be depreciated over its useful life. Jim, did I miss anything?
No, you covered everything.
Jeanette, I don't remember if this is in the policy or not. And if it isn't, I would like to add it because I know we discussed it in previous meetings, and that was mileage reimbursement at the IRS rate for board members. As long as they're not being reimbursed from other entities. Is that in our policy?
Yes.
It isn't, okay. So if we approve the policy, then we approve that as well.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
Yeah.
that is in, it's on page 4.
great, excellent, thank you.
So appreciate the work that's been done. I do have a couple questions. The first is there an urgency to this one, or is this something that we could take up in May once we've all had a chance to really review it?
We could, but again, the mileage reimbursement, if we do it today, then we could have the expense checks cut back to the board members, but
I'm gonna make a motion that we table this. It just feels more comfortable to me that we have an opportunity to really review these things before we just really vote on them.
I'll second the motion.
do table. Okay. Are there any questions for Jeanette or for Jim before we move on?
Question, should we memorialize our earlier action about making sure that the funds set aside for operations are going to stay there? Is that,
I thought that was in the motion, isn't it, Mike? Yeah,
should that be reflected in our policy in any way, or?
It's in there. It's,
Is it, okay,
I mean, the way we're a fund accounting.
that's how we operate.
Organization, so when money's put into a fund to spend it, you have to budget off of it. You have to pass a budget, spend money, so. You will pass an operating budget, which will then first money in the fund up to your operating budget. That's your control is your budget, right?
Jeanette and Jim, thank you for your work on this, and we'll revisit it next month. I neglected to mention that the investment policy will be available on the website after the meeting. Is that right, Mike?
Vote on the motion to table.
Vote on the table.
Okay. Or we just not vote on it, but that's fine. We have a first and a second.
You technically don't need a vote to table it, to not pass it today. You didn't need to make that motion. We can just pull it and move it to.
Can we have both of these policies emailed to us?
I'm sorry.
He wants the policies emailed.
Of course, yes. Jeff, we can vote, that's fine. We have a first and a second. Any questions, discussions? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
All right, grant making. Tom, you got the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I want to continue to thank our grant making committee. I know all the committees are hardworking and the grant committee is really hardworking. And so all of you who are on that committee, I appreciate you. We meet regularly. You have in your board packet a grant making policy draft and application that that we've been working on and look forward for your conversation and hopefully at some point approval. Like just to give you a very high level and not, in the interest of time, not read it to you. The general model is to, this policy recognizes that the regions vary greatly in their capacity to administer this. Some of the regions are up, running and ready to go. Others are looking to us to set a policy for managing this process. So we've come up with a process that we think accommodates both. Regions will make decisions on what they're going to fund. However, that will have to comply, as we also saw in the grant making policy, with the terms of the MOU, and those are identified in the policy. We've addressed issues of conflict of interest and expert panel along with that. When there are statewide funding, then this will make decisions about that, but otherwise our role with the regions will be to oversee their process. Regions can also customize the application. We're going to talk later, I think, about grant software. It's a bit up in the air yet, but we will engage a software that allows for that. I think I want to stop talking, see what questions you have, and move us into a conversation about what we need to do to get this policy moving forward.
Just for the application, when I looked through it, is this going to be like an online with drop down boxes? I mean,
That's what we have in mind, yes, and that the grant software would support that.
Okay.
So we would imagine that anybody applying would do that, and then we would send to the region all of their applications, and the region would make its decisions for their regional funding.
So the regions apply first to the software and then it comes back to the regions to.
Yeah. That's how and anybody in the committee that feels more articulate than I can, please speak up, but yeah, that's the process we talked about.
Okay.
So the committee spent a great deal of time, and I commend Tom for his leadership of the committee. It's a little bit like herding cats, because I think it's probably the biggest committee we have. Also like to thank Claudia for all her input into the process. She's done a great job with us. So we've kind of hashed on this, and I feel really comfortable that we've landed in a really good spot, and advocate that we pass this today so we can get this out to the region.
So I too serve on the policy committee, and I too want to thank Tom and others for not only the many meetings that we had, but also the recognition that different regions are doing different things at different times. And so this application is substantial. It's a boilerplate that will address everyone's regions. But in Region 2, we have already done a version of this that is more extensive and includes things like underserved populations. It talks about inclusion and diversity. And so those are things that are very important and specific, I think, to Region 2. And so I just want to let those in the position that I'm in say that so this will serve as kind of the boilerplate, a common application for all. But we are adding language into Region 2's application So that when someone goes in to apply, they will see this, they will have to fill it out. But they will, in addition to that, they will have to fill out something that is applicable only to Region 2. So if other regions want to do something like that specific to your regions, I'm happy to share. And Tom, I think we already did share with you the additional language that Region 2 would add. But I had a great deal of concern about that, about the applications that we're getting responding to the priorities of our region, which we've flushed out. And so we are able to do that under this process. So I thank you for that and for the deference of the committee and allowing for something outside of just the standard to move forward.
And I would say, Denise, your folks did share that, and Claudia's last official act with was for she and I to go through it, and we thought it was a great application. What I think would be really helpful is if we can facilitate regions sharing things with each other so people can learn from each other and borrow and all that, but we're not going to try to cram everybody into the thing. I would say about Jeff's point about herding cats, that cats are hard to herd, but you can move the food. And the food's not coming out until we get this.
Well done, sir. Well done.
So Tom, are you looking for an approval today on this?
Make a recommendation, motion to move this policy forward. Thank you.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, excellent. Are there any questions or discussions, including the online folks? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Oppose?
Could I abstain?
Aye.
Well, because my organization will be an applicant.
Oh, I think that's fine.
No, we've addressed that in the conflict of interest.
Then
I'd
yes.
like to abstain as well.
Okay. Well, we do appreciate the hard work. We know this is one of the more challenging committees and frankly, one of the most important ones. So thank you, Tom, for your hard work and the committee members.
But I ask your indulgence for about 2 more minutes.
Absolutely.
We mentioned that Claudia Harold was someone we contracted with, who tremendously helpful. Her service has concluded as she's retired. I think in general, we would like to think about having a grants staff person, and you would defer time till you get your exec hired. We don't need to discuss this now. It's just a suggestion to the executive committee and really to all of you. We need that position as soon as we can. And while I would prefer to wait for the executive director, I would encourage us to think about the search going forward. We need staff to do this.
And I would just like to echo Tom's comments too. I think it's critical that we get a person that can manage the grants process, especially since it's going to be launched in the near future. I think it's absolutely critical we get someone on board as quickly as possible. And I think the one thing that we did talk about in the grants committee was having, maybe a series of webinars for the regions and for potential applicants to review the process so that everybody has a good understanding. And then I would just like to commend Tom and Claudia. They did a wonderful job in assembling all of this.
Thank you, Jeanette. We have lost our in-person quorum, so we can't, the rest of this meeting will be informational. Still important, but we won't be voting. So with that said, maybe I'll defer. We can still talk about the grant software. So I'm going to skip the financial report and go because that does usually require approval. If you could Jim, talk about the grant software, please.
Sure, absolutely. So a separate document in the your iPads, there is a document called grant software. So I'll give you a little bit of what we've been working on. Now that you passed the grant policy, we have a little bit more direction. Right? I've been working with the assumption that that we're going to pass that policy, and the things that Tom and the other members have talked about, the regional processes, the regional applications. That starts fitting the software that can actually pull that off. It starts limiting that, right? So that's what we've been talking to. In February, was in your packet, grant software comparison. It includes the 3 software that are in this proposal: Fondant, Kia Go and Salesforce. I think Salesforce and Fondant were a recommendation of board members, I think, and Kia Go was a recommendation of Claudia. And so those were the ones we really focused on. We also looked at two others called Blackbaud and Flux. They're great softwares. They kind of push the upper limits and exceed the budget that we currently have of 100,000. So I haven't included those in this for those reasons. So let's just quickly go through the options. So Fondant, many of you have probably heard of Fondant. They handle somewhere in the neighborhood of 600-700 foundations. They are a smaller company. When we first talked, they said, they were very honest with me. They said, you know, we can't do it. And so I looked at their software a little further. We went back and forth. I finally, the key to the software is to get beyond the salesperson to an engineer. You need to get to an engineer to implement these things. And so I was talking to an engineer. He thinks he's worked out a process which we can use that would allow each region to have an application. The application would go to the regions. The regions, in their case, would need to have an administrator. The administrator would basically manage those reviews because they have an issue with dual reviews, right? Manage those reviews and then send it on to the foundation. Okay, it's based on Amazon Web Services. They have a SOC 2 audit, which is essentially required here. You need to be audited on your software. It's kind of plain and vanilla. It's simple, right? It's not real fancy, right? But it does the job. Right? They're coming in with an annual fee around 25,000 with a one-time setup fee of around 27,000. Okay, that includes the whole community suite, which includes accounting, donor management, CRM, which is customer relations management, communication. It includes all the things that the foundation needs. I will second the need for an additional grants person, because this software, like some of the others, requires a lot of work by the organization, right? To set up, to organize, right? You can have them do it, but you're going to pay their $200 an hour type of fee. So Fondant's going to need us to put some serious effort into it. The next one I looked at, and we went back and forth a lot, is the Kia Go. It's less as known.
Chairman, just as a point of order, Evan Clearmeyer is trying to get back into the meeting, which would get us back into a quorum situation, I believe.
We have quorum all together, but we don't have quorum in the room.
Oh.
But thanks, we'll let him in.
We will let them.
So are there any questions about Fondant? We'll talk to our CPA. They're familiar with Fondant, and they gave me good reviews. And they gave me a couple of people to talk to. I talked to them. So any questions on Fondant?
You say the regions would have to have somebody there to, because that could be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, their solution was that someone at the region would need to shepherd the request because the software wouldn't be able to do that based on their review process. So they essentially don't have a review process that would jump organizations. They don't have something that's called branching, which the other softwares do. So that's the caveat to that. But they're pretty confident. To the engineers, they said the process email yesterday about exactly how that would work.
Jim, if you could just do high level on the other two,
Sure.
and then what I'd like to do
Sure, the
is
differences,
allow the board to think about it for a month.
Yep.
And prepare any questions, and we can come back next month and discuss.
Could we talk just for a minute or two about the process? If we don't have a quorum, we don't do it, but we've already heard questions from our regions about how they work. I wonder if there's value in a subcommittee that includes fiscal members, Jim, but also a few grant committee members that get together and meet with some of these vendors and can pose their questions. Some of us, Jeanette, I think Greta and others, and not me, but I'd be happy to have a lot of experience with this. And so I just wonder if we want to put users in front of these potential vendors and pressure test them.
I like that. So if we could, any volunteers, if you could contact Catherine and she could develop the committee.
If you haven't volunteered, I'll help you decide to.
I could help you too. I just, eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Is that a thumbs up, Greta? Do you have experience with it?
I'd be happy to volunteer as well.
Thank you.
All right, yeah. So I have basically told the software companies that it will most likely be larger review of and that they would, you know, they need to show us how it will work. Right now, they're showing us how their software works and what changes they would make. We're like, okay, you have to like show us exactly how it would, right? So that's really the next step, right? IKEA Go is more polished. It doesn't have quite as many foundations, but it's a little bit stronger in the grants area. It has branching. It doesn't have these two. Both of these do not have individual portal branding, which we talked about at so it would be a single portal, but once they go into the portal, then they would go to the region that they're associated with, right? That either would be a map, which they click on and say, this region, zip code or something that would put them in the region and get that region's application. IKEA Go, it's just a little bit more of a sophisticated system. It has better integration of the grants and the accounting, right? It has better fund management. It is based on Microsoft, so it's a Microsoft Dynamics product, so it interacts well with the Office products, Office Exchange, SharePoint. And so it's better integration there. Their price is 52,000 would be the annual price, and then they're estimating 35,000 for the design, right? And so as we talked through with the engineer, they came up with certain number of what they call pro build designs. If we need more, I think it's like 160 an hour for additional. So could creep up a little bit depending on exactly what we want them to build for us and what we're capable of building ourselves, right? Or adapting yourself. The last software is Salesforce, which probably most of you are familiar with. It is the largest of the three grant softwares. They are essentially a customer relationship management software system, which they have adapted to nonprofit organizations, right? They do not have an accounting package. So we would buy a NetSuite, QuickBooks, something like that, and have the integrator interface those. The other two softwares, first two I've talked about, they do it all themselves, right? They do the implementation. Salesforce does not implement. Right? They use third-party implementers. We've been talking with the third-party implementer out of the Cincinnati area called Perlocity. Would be a separate contract with Perlocity along with the Salesforce to and then that's who Salesforce recommends for nonprofit implementations. They have offices here in Ohio. Salesforce kind of surprised us a little bit with their price. They came back with $42,700, right? Just like sales people do. That's the price for April, right? So I'm not sure what the May price would be, but that's the price. Salesforce uses a little bit different model and licensing than the other two. The other two are essentially unlimited. So grantees, applicants are unlimited. Salesforce uses for grantees, applicants, reviewers, they use a login process. So if each login, you buy logins, right? And so once you hit the max of logins, then we can log in. So somebody logs in 5 times a month, that's 5 logins. Right? That's how they priced it. So 42 is based on some assumptions, and Catherine and I were on that talk with them trying to, like, how many logins are we gonna have exactly? There are peaks in the year when we'll have a lot, and then there'll be peaks, we don't have any, right, or very few, right? So that's their model. Implementation. Fondant can move pretty quickly, probably can have an application up in a month. Here goes pushing a month to 6 weeks. Salesforce. Salesforce gave us 2 prices. One is a basic price, which is $150,000. And one is the full custom 19 portals with 19 processes in one system. It's actually $395. I just got it today, so $395. But that's an 8 to 10 month implementation. The basic is probably what did they say, Catherine? Probably 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, the basic basically cut it in half. It's still roughly around 150,000 plus, give or take. But I do want to remind the directors today is that whichever software we go with, there is yes, they can have it up and running. That doesn't mean that the training has been done. That just means the software has been built and is ready for us to be trained on. So there is another component of training that I want you to be mindful of as we go through this process, because ultimately it will most likely shift the timeline for the training component to be added.
So we'll stop there in the interest of time. We'll come back next month. So think about any questions you might have, and we'll vet this thoroughly. We're also going to send out the financial report, the ED report timeline to you. And we have some board training from Mike, and just go right in that and then close the meeting. Would anybody like to take a 5-minute break? Yeah, can we go ahead and do that? Take 5. I'll just be back at 25 after. That's a 9-minute break.
So I'm assuming the expedition.
Expeditious that.
Projects.
See, I see. They are recorded here and then they're recorded again. I tried.
Software program is ready to accept regional applications. Some manner. Software. Here by Shotter's car.
Oh, it happened a while ago.
Just then, she was talking about drop down. We've seen the software drop.
So much white.
So.
He's okay though.
The MOU, the 98 percentage, are not necessarily for the.
Restaurant.
Yeah. See what I'm saying? So by the time he reaches his money, it's probably.
The guy was nice. He left the card. Just to make. So we can go right for it.
This,
We actually distributed.
I'll make it. I'll try to make.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, sit here for you. Well, not that they will, but they will. Yeah. So I know what to.
Really? I have you down on that. It is. And
Things I was like.
and we had, we also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the Ohio State University.
Thanks for bringing that to my attention.
This is the prevention side. Yeah.
You saw for them. You're gonna be talking.
You know what? Oh, it's all good.
Showed us 17 reduction.
No, I.
Yeah, we're gonna talk.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
Work, sir.
I've got models for the economic.
Sorry, Andy, do we have a final investment?
Spend a little and the societal cost.
Right.
It's not an eight.
I think it's the fine.
Okay.
Whatever.
So we need.
Something that's.
So it's a, you know, I comment.
No.
Yeah,
Go out.
absolutely.
We're talking about.
Yeah, no, I know. And so these, I don't.
Ask Jim.
From NIH, CDC, it's all of their. Independent company. But I'll send it to you. Do you have a card? Ask you the information.
Have it.
I'll send you all the evidence based. I'll send you the EOR. All right, great.
Circle there.
All right, thanks. Nice meeting you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's pretty huge.
I saw your.
Reduce the number of drugs, overdose on the drugs, need treatment.
The actual contracts that you signed.
All of it.
You can buy a whole bunch of. Public request, but yeah.
Yes, that's just it. We're trying to prevent people from doing this.
Well, I feel so. Obviously.
Got rid of their billion. Got rid of their billion bill.
Old enough now to deactivate the billion. There are a lot more sitting on.
And when you set it up like.
You know, okay, that's what I've heard.
I don't necessarily like them all.
I can't say it either. Obvious answer to me.
We're gonna, no, this is different. This is your chair. No, that's not.
Right.
What is?
Different states. The first doesn't have.
But I had.
That's what the most is. I can block somewhere.
Yeah, and then they drop fentanyl in it.
Go ahead and get started. If everybody can start. Got two seats, please.
Oh, I got. My whole housing department.
Yes, I bet.
There was really good time last night.
Yeah.
Let me, Larry, Kathy want to do it.
Okay, all right.
Really.
They're strong enough.
It was late for 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah. Any.
Strong enough that it can get. Under
Oh, that's, yeah, I mean, any organic compound, so that's the carpet inside here. If you have any questions, give me a call. I can send you all the scientific studies on it. Absorption, oh God, it's great stuff.
Yo, Larry. After. Wow.
We gotta do it. Ready to be a public official. Steal my gavel. You can.
Yeah. It even has your name on it.
Very upset that your Jayhawks didn't get through.
You know, there's a dispensation when you won the national championship.
Yes.
Jason.
There is.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Is he back in Alberta?
Right. For that, but yeah.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I realize this is the last agenda item of the day, so you're probably all ready to get out of here, but the chairman and Ms. Whittington did ask me to give just a short board training. All of you, or the vast majority of you, have probably served on nonprofit boards before. Some of this might be repetitive, but my hope is to give some actual examples of how some of these legal concepts apply to One Ohio and the unique scope of One Ohio, in addition to just going over some very basic best board practices toward the end. So 3 things we'll cover, and I'll try to do this as expeditiously as possible. If you have questions, you could certainly talk to me at the end, or we can do them as a group, whichever you would prefer. But the first being the role of the board, your board's legal duties, and then best board practice. So what's on the screen in front of you, and also the presentation is on your iPads, do it that way. But this is taken directly from your articles of incorporation, and this sums up the mission and purpose of the organization. It was also submitted to the IRS with your tax exemption application. And I put this up there not because I'm going to read through it, but because it's something that you all as board members should be aware of, because every decision that we make in one way, shape, or form has to go back to supporting and enhancing the purpose that we have here. So legal duties of the board. So you might have heard that you all are what's considered fiduciaries. Fiduciaries are, I don't know, someone that acts for another purpose, another person or organization benefit. And so there are fiduciary duties that are set out not only in the Internal Revenue Code federally, but also in the Ohio Revised Code under Chapter 1702. And today I'll talk about the 3 most important fiduciary duties that apply to all of you. The first is, and I would argue the most important, is the duty of care. And essentially, and this top bullet here is a bit of legalese that I'll kind of flesh out below, but a director is required to act in good faith with the care of an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. So what does this mean in reality? So as directors, you carry out your duty of care by reviewing all the materials that are provided to you in some scope before the meeting, not showing up to the meeting and looking at materials for the first time. Be reasonable, not reckless in your decision making. I think there are a lot of good examples of that here today, that you want to take time to ensure, whether that's done at the committee level or at the full board level, that the major decisions impacting the organization are thought out and that there is deliberation among board members. The biggest way, that third bullet point there, that you can carry out your duty of care is simply by attending board meetings. Regular attendance is critical, particularly if the organization were ever to be sued and you as an individual board member sued. If you just show up once every 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, and that one time you show up, that meeting is stemming any legal action, your non-attendance or non-regular attendance can be used against you. And then actively engaging and participating in the decision-making. Deliberating like we did here today, that deliberation is then contained in the board meeting minutes, and that serves as our evidence that the board is in fact satisfying its duty of care. Really important to mention the bottom point there, that board members who know the facts, analyze the probable results of their actions, and exercise sound judgment, fulfill their duty of care regardless of if the decision was right or wrong. So if we have a grant policy in place, we have an expert panel that will come online, all of the policy will govern how we approve grants. The expert panel and the regions will vet those individuals. If for some reason this board approves a grant to an organization and that allocation is fraudulently used, not for tax exempt purposes, the very fact that we have those safeguards in place, whether it be the regions, the policy, the expert panel, all of those are protecting you all and the organization, even though it could be argued that the organization made the wrong decision by giving funds to an organization that used them fraudulently. So duty of care as pertains to One Ohio directors. Obviously, One Ohio is very unique in the fact that a traditional board, typically board members are appointed by the current board, or if it's a new organization, it's done via the incorporator. The second bullet point there, this is taken directly from the MOU, states that all board members shall serve as fiduciaries of the foundation as required by Ohio Revised Code 1702. That's the chapter that is regarding board member fiduciary duties. And what this means is that you as a director, even though you might be appointed by the governor or appointed by a certain region, your ultimate duty is to the One Ohio Recovery Foundation Board. And so when you all are making decisions, although you might hear questions from your region or concerns from your region, and you can certainly bring those concerns and questions to the board for deliberation, at the end of the day, when you are casting your vote in support of or in opposition to any resolution, that should be done putting the best interest of the organization in mind, not the best interest of your particular region or whoever appointed you to the board. Next is the duty of loyalty. So directors are required to exercise their power in the interest of the organization and not in their personal interests. What this means is that the board has a conflicts of interest policy and we need to follow it, whether that be a direct or indirect financial interest. So every year you will make annual disclosures that you don't have a direct or indirect financial interest with One Ohio Recovery Foundation. If that changes for some reason, it must be disclosed. So two quick examples, a direct financial interest. I think that's most of us understand what that is. Let's say we're leasing new office space and we're buying furniture. If you as a director have some type of ownership interest in the furniture company that we're entering into a contract with, then you must not only disclose that information, but you wouldn't be able to vote or even deliberate on that proposed transaction. An indirect financial interest occurs much more frequently with nonprofit boards. Frequently, as you know, nonprofits like to collaborate with them. Most common that we see is sharing office space from one another. So it could occur that you as a director of this board are also on the board of a potential landlord that the organization leases office space from in the near future. You don't have any financial interest in that relationship, but that is what's considered an indirect financial interest. And so as a result of that, you would be able to deliberate or vote on that potential transaction. So anytime that One Ohio is working with another nonprofit organization that you so happen to serve on, we need to be very cautious that potentially we might have a duty of loyalty issue that pops up. Duty of obedience, very similar and kind of an offshoot to duty of care and duty of loyalty. I'll skip down to that third bullet point there, that we satisfy this duty by having familiarity with our organization's governing documents. So understanding generally what's in our bylaws, and if you have questions reverting to the bylaws or asking your legal counsel, and being familiar with your policies and procedures. So what's your conflict of interest policy state? How does that get carried out in practice? We have a whistleblower policy in state or in place. All of those you as directors have to have some level of knowledge of to satisfy this duty. And then two quick concepts here before we get into kind of best board practices. This is the concept of private benefit. And essentially what this means is the organization giving an unfair advantage to potential applicants. So an example, let's say we have organization one is from, or let's say the organization is putting out grants for statewide grant applicants. We have two applicants. One of them, organization one, is represented by a region that Director A is from. Organization two is from a region represented by Director B. So Director A, longstanding director, serves as an officer of the organization, very influential with his fellow board members. Director B, a newer board member. These proposals come in. Organizations 2 proposal is objectively stronger based on not only our grant policy, but what the expert panel has weighed in on. But Director A uses his status to convince directors to approve organization's 1 project because it would benefit his region. That would be an example of a private benefit. You utilizing your position to steer a grant application to someone in your region and going against the systems and the policies that we have put in place regarding grant making. Private inurement, I'm not going to go too much into detail with this, except for the very fact that under examples, the first bullet point there, the easiest way to get tripped up under this is with compensating executives of the organization. We want to make sure that any time that we're negotiating salary for a CEO or an executive director role, it's done at arm's length. It's reasonable for the services performed, and it's not structured as a mechanism for distributing any leftover profits for the organization. The easiest way we can satisfy this is setting our compensation based on what similar organizations are compensating their executive directors for. So doing salary studies, which I know was done in the case of the current opening for executive director. We just want to make sure that we have facts that we can fall back on to ensure that the organization will not get tripped up by this concept. So now quickly, I'll go over the role of the board. We'll do a couple areas here. First, the mission, then the organization's programs, finances, and employees. So with the mission, and these are all done in a chart form. So it's what's the board's role, what's the executive director and staff role. So you as board members ultimately approving the mission, vision, and values in addition to the strategic plan. That's something that's always going to fall in your lap as a board, with the executive director and staff's role as working with the board to develop those. The board ultimately, as the fiduciary, is responsible for the legal and ethical compliance in many ways with not only the IRS, but with the Ohio Attorney General's office and others. That role would then, the day-to-day role of that, ensuring that compliance would fall on the executive director or any other outside vendors that would be responsible for submitting government compliance items. And then finally, I'll go down to the last box there. The board enacting rules by which directors appointed to the board must follow. We would say typically see this of boards being done, having attendance requirements, having other requirements as far as parliamentary procedure, so that if we do ever get into a situation where there is disagreement between the board, that there with parliamentary procedure, there's something that we can specifically fall back on, that your legal counsel can make a ruling on, and we can have we can put closure to any lingering questions that might be out there. over whether a particular resolution was properly passed or a motion was properly made, that type of thing. So programs, as we did today, the board ultimately responsible for approving the allocations, the grants, and the grant guidelines. The executive director and staff certainly have insight into that, and then would be responsible for providing ongoing information that the board needs to approve future allocations or future grant or setting grant guidelines. Grantee oversight, the board is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the grants that are being made are being used for the purposes that are set out. Although it is the staff's responsibility for conducting those site visits and most importantly, bringing to whether it be a particular committee or bringing it to the concern of the full board, any concerns regarding not abiding by the organization's oversight requirements. And then finally, the board's role, the third row down there, bringing community needs and opportunities to the board. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the best ways that board members can be valuable to any organization, any type of nonprofit, because you are all community leaders in one way or another. Bringing, what are the gaps that you're seeing in your community that might exist in other regions or the state of Ohio? Bringing that to the executive committee or to the particular committees and the executive staff so that we can find a way to try to meet those unmet needs moving forward. Finances, board ultimately responsible for passing the annual budget and making recommendations as needed. More often than not, it's the staff that is proposing the annual budget that is then brought to the board's finance committee for deliberation. Second one down, this is becoming much more popular, especially with complex organizations, developing and approving key financial indicators that are regularly discussed at board meetings. I'll be the first one to say that I am not an accountant and not someone that is very fluid in reviewing financial statements. And there are quite a few other board members, I'm assuming, that might be that way as well. But deciphering down what are our key performance indicators that we can fit on a dashboard or incorporating in the financial statements in some way, shape, or form, so that everything that's going on financially, which could be very complex, can be synthesized down so that a non-finance based board member can have a general understanding of the financial performance of the organization. The next one down, the board approving internal controls or reports. We talked about that in the finance policy that passed today. Those can be everything from how much can executive staff spend on contracts before they have to be board approved to what happens if we have budgeted overages. Those were all passed in that policy that you have today. Most importantly, reviewing the finances regularly. It should be an agenda item every single month. There should be a formal approval of those financials to solidify the fact that you all have reviewed them and admit them to be true. And the last point there, set fundraising goals and approve a fundraising plan. So as a 501c3, you do have the ability to go out and get charitable gifts. You do have a fundraising policy, and I'll touch on that as my last slide. But it's the board's goal, if we are going to go out and fundraise, to set a plan for what are we fundraising for, to direct the staff to go carry that out. So the staff would be identifying any donors, developing those materials and making those asks, but it's ultimately the board that has the oversight into the scope of our fundraising and then accepting those gifts. And then finally, people. So you as the board have one staff member you're directly responsible for, and that is the executive director. The executive director then is responsible for all other staff. That can be a point of contention. I'll talk about that briefly on the next slide. The board is responsible for approving all personnel policies and any pay scales. It would then be the executive director's job to take those pay scales and find staff that he or she believes would suit the organization. Approving employee benefits, that would be a board function that you all would be responsible for. And then with the executive director implementing those benefits plans And then finally, the executive director should report on a regular basis to you what the staffing levels are. We don't have to get into a whole lot of detail. In fact, I would recommend that you don't get into a whole lot of detail, but you should at the very least know if there are staff openings, what the plan are to fill those staff openings. So I mentioned on the last slide that where organizations can get into trouble is when we have friction between the board or the executive committee and the executive director. And so developing that relationship is extremely important. Number one, in the way you can avoid pretty much the majority of issues is establishing clear goals that are developed by the board, that are tangible, that are quantitative, that can be on a piece of paper, and we have an idea as far as whether that executive director is meeting the goals of the organization. That would help drive any bonuses or raises in the future for that individual. We want to have a relationship that the executive director can feel free to contact the board president or the executive committee or him or her designee about issues that are arising. So the last thing we really want is for surprises to come up at board meetings. We want at least, whether it be the board chair or the executive director, or I'm sorry, the board chair, the executive committee, to have an idea on, are there concerns that coming up between now and when the board meets next, so that the appropriate board members can be notified and that we can have a focused and tailored discussion. And then just some good governance practices that we talk about with every time we give this presentation. So meeting attendance, setting some type of meeting attendance criteria. A board member have to, at a minimum, show up every quarter, twice a year, but what works for all of you, setting that board attendance expectation. Committees, this organization does an incredible job with utilizing committees to be able to carry out the work of the organization. Understanding programs and services, unique in the fact that you are a funder and not an organization that a lot of times receives funding. But I would encourage all of you, once those grants start being made, that you as directors go out to those various programs and entities to see how the funding that we're utilizing is impacting individuals across the state of Ohio. And then a board retreat or strategic plan. We recommend that boards have at least a retreat on an annual basis, just to talk about where the organization has been for the last year, where we see it going for the upcoming 12 months and for the next several years down the road. And then finally, running effective meetings. Again, these are pretty standard things, but make sure we have a written agenda and keep the conversation absolutely focused on that agenda. Recommend adopting some sort of parliamentary procedure, whether that be Robert's Rules or Mason's Manual, depending on what everyone is comfortable with. So if we do ever get into situations where there is disagreement as to how the meeting is being run, that we have something to formally fall back on. And then the final point there, delegate work to committees, which this organization does. Final two topics. These are things that I've heard talked about in committee meetings that I've been in. I don't know that a whole lot of people are familiar with these as board members. So especially the scope of this entity, I thought it'd just take a couple minutes to talk about this. The first is lobbying. So as an organization that has quite a bit of resources at its disposal, it will likely come about that people will ask you and ask the organization to weigh in on how can we continue to fight this epidemic in the state of Ohio. So under the Internal Revenue Code, there are two types of lobbying. The first being what's considered grassroots lobbying, the second being direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying is essentially the organization urging members of the public to contact their legislator to support or oppose a certain policy item. So you'll hear commercials often that says, call Senator so-and-so, tell them to support Senate Bill 10. Direct lobbying is when the organization is the one or their contractor, the lobbying firm, that is telling legislators or their staff to support or oppose specific legislation. So there are two tests that nonprofits can utilize in order to be able to lobby under the Internal Revenue Code. I'll go down to, I'll start with insubstantial part test. So this is the default test that the IRS gauges all nonprofits on unless you specifically state you want to use the expenditure test. So the insubstantial part test says that no substantial part of a charity's activities may be carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. So in great government fashion, the IRS has never defined what insubstantial means. So there's a whole lot of opinions out there on it. However, what we constantly find is that an organization may spend 3 to 5% of their annual revenue or annual expenditures on lobbying. So take 3 to 5% of what our annual budget is, and we could utilize that on lobbying. The other test, the expenditure test, organizations that like to do a lot of lobbying like to use this test because it guarantees them protection from the IRS. So any organization over $17 million in annual expenses can spend up to $1 million annually on lobbying. And to do so, you have to file an IRS form one time. If that's something the organization wants to do in the future, would highly recommend doing that to protect yourself. Political activities. So as a 501c3 nonprofit, you may not participate in or intervene in a political campaign for any candidate or public office. However, there are a couple exceptions that you may or may not know about. The first being that voter education is always permissible. Voter registration and get out the vote activities are always permissible. And thirdly, and what might be most applicable to this organization is ballot measures. So if there would be a constitutional question that would come up that would impact opiates in the future, this organization could weigh in on that, whether we want citizens of Ohio to support or to oppose that. Any expenditures that we spend on ballot measures that would count against our lobbying limits that I took or that I mentioned previously. And then finally, fundraising. I just want to piggyback off a couple slides earlier with fundraising. So most importantly, organization does have a gift acceptance policy, just so you are all aware of it. Anytime we receive a simple gift, so if a foundation gives us a grant or we get a check or some type of stock, that must be approved by the executive committee. Any complex gift, which is defined as personal property or someone grants us an estate or a retirement plan, that is something that not only has to be approved by the executive committee, but then approved by the full board. And that was about as quick as I could do that. Just
That was amazing.
so, if you have questions, I'll be around after, but are there any before we complete?
You did a great job.
You did it great.
Thank you. And just to remind everybody who hasn't, we'll send an email out. Casey, remind me that not everybody's gotten it, especially the new board members.
I already sent it out.
So there you go. But we do need to complete the Attorney General's online. It's very similar to this, but it's more broad. And that was part of our agreement getting in the fund. So we need to do that before we disperse funds. Right now, we have about 50% participation. With that, we don't even need a vote to close because we don't have a quorum. Thanks for coming and thanks for all the hard work.